Okay, so I am back, and today I want to get into a little bit about the whole retirement system and Social Security. And, I feel like there's a lot of common misconceptions about the whole Social Security system and retirement. A lot of people think, they're wondering whether or not they'll be able to retire off of Social Security, just basically, kind of a pension fund for those who are too old to work, which basically means a pension, but it's called Social Security. Now, it wasn't initially meant to be a pension fund at the start, but now it is. And so, a lot of people are confused on whether or not Social Security can last uh, long enough for them to claim it, whether or not it's going to run out of money. Because there are some people out there who are saying that Social Security will be depleted by 2035, and so maybe they think they won't get their payments. And there's a lot of confusion out there, but let me kind of clear up all the confusion. So I've gone to quite a bit of websites to try to look at some of the a lot of the factors that will affect whether or not you're able to retire off of the Social Security. And I think it, it plays a lot into how you should invest and how you should position yourself so that you are not a victim and that maybe you could make a lot of money off of it. And so let's start off by going through the 2035 Social Security benefits depletion thing. And so the Social Security will not really be depleted by 35. What the Social Security Board of Trustees said in 2020 in their annual report is that the trust fund might, the actual assets might be depleted by 2035. Now, that doesn't mean it's not, that's just its cash reserves. Not really, it's not its total assets, and also not its, ability to pay other people money. It's just its cash reserves. And what that means is, first of all, it still has a bunch of assets that are not cash reserves. And that means it also has the ability to generate income and pay that income out. And so it could just sell some of its other assets. And then, it's also collecting income, it's collecting revenue, now it has to pay out some money. But that's not too big of a deal. Now, unfortunately, it's not gonna, the cash reserves aren't gonna last forever. That's unfortunate, but it's really not that big of a deal for running out of money by 2035. It just means its cash reserves are going to be low by 2035. And, maybe it could sell some of its other assets. Maybe its income, it still has a lot of income. And if you look at its income, well, it's not going to have to sell that many of its assets anyways. So it's going to have to sell a little, but it's not even that much that they have to sell. Now, I think some of the bigger issues is not actually the Social Security running out of money. That's not what I think the worry should be. I think the worry should more so be the fact that Social Security, if we get inflation, well, then you have fixed income. But I'll talk a little bit about that later. And I just want to go on to an estimate here. And so historically, Social Security and the other unfunded liabilities like Medicare and Medicaid have taken up a pretty small amount of the GDP, and the percentage that it takes up of the GDP has been climbing pretty much forever, pretty much ever since they've been I guess, passed. Ever since they've started, their share of the GDP has been climbing. Now, the estimate is by, the government estimate, is that it's kind of going to top off and become stagnant. The unfunded liabilities, the cost as a percentage of GDP is kind of going to become stagnant in around 2040, and it's just going to slowly, very, very slowly, move up ever since the 2040. Now, Medicare, Medicaid might rise a little bit, but Social Security is going to actually just stay pretty much the same or even fall. I don't know if that's really going to be true, because I'm not exactly sure how they estimate the GDP. And of course, they don't account too much for recessions, depressions. Their lines are quite linear, actually, compared to the historical, the historical numbers. And so I'm not exactly sure if it's really going to be accurate, because it's not only how much they cost, but it's actually also where the GDP is. So it's kind of a moving target, and it's not the best measurement of everything either. But basically, until 2024, you could expect Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid to cost more money. And so that a lot of is because of the age distribution. And, if you actually look at the age distribution, and I want to go over there actually, if you look at the age distribution, the boomer population is just huge. There's a huge boomer population. The Gen X population, which is after the boomer, is quite a lot lower, and the millennials are a little bit higher than the Gen X and a bit lower than the boomers. Now, the silent generation, which is the one before the boomers, which is basically the oldest generation now, who are basically the people, most of the people using the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. I mean, it's mostly the older people who are using the medical benefits as well. So you can kind of clump these, Social Security and the medical benefits together if you want to look at the age distribution, because it's almost the exact same people who are using the two benefits. But the point is, the boomer population, and I'm not talking about the population, I'm talking about the amount of people born of each population. So that's different. Because if you're just looking at the population, you're kind of getting the wrong picture, because people die off. When you're old, you die off, and so obviously the generation with the most old people is going to usually be the generation with the least people. But if you look at the amount of people born, well, then you get a more clear picture of how many people are going to be there when they become old. And the boomer population, the amount of boomers born is almost, and not quite, but almost double the population of the last or of the prior generation. And it's not really quite there, but it's almost double. I guess it's off by a bit, but it's a big difference there. And so, you could expect Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid to cost, maybe a third more, or not exactly half more, maybe half because people are living longer, but it's going to cost a lot more. That's the point. And if you want to look at the estimates for the boomer generation by around 2040, 2045, it's going to be kind of equal to the silent generation's population today. Now, that it might sound a little bit confusing. What exactly does that mean? I think, in my opinion, I think that kind of just means that in the next few years, we're going to have to spend a lot more on these unfunded liabilities. And this whole geopolitical thing has, a lot to do with monetary fiscal policy. And it really has a lot to do with how you invest. If you want to invest using macro as a tool. And, if you look at the life expectancy of the United States, it's been climbing. Yeah, it's obviously been climbing. Now, it's not been climbing too rapidly. I mean, it's, in the last, 1960, the life expectancy in the US was, around 70 years old. And in around 2020, well, 2020 is a little bit distorted because of COVID. But let's look at 2018 because I just have that number. It's around 78.5. So, we've had 60 years and the life expectancy has climbed 8.5 years, which is, I mean, it's all right, but I also think that means that they're going to push the age of retirement further back. And that's what we've been doing all along to prevent the cash reserves of Social Security from just drying up. But I think another important thing to look at is not just, what we own. It's not just how much assets they have. It's not just how much cash they have, but it's also what they're investing in. And if you want to look at pension funds and what they invest in, it's going to be interesting. So if you search up, what pension funds invest in, it shows fixed income investments, so bonds, and they also have some, student loan and credit card debt, but it's mostly just corporate and government bonds. And they also have stocks, mostly blue chip stocks. So basically the safe, the higher dividend, just conservative stocks. They have some private equity, and, they also have some real estate, and they go into real estate mostly using these REITs. And so, I mean, they also have a little bit of inflation protecting assets, which I think is quite important for these fixed income beneficiaries, which is the people who receive the pensions. And so basically, if you look at, now here's the important thing, if you look at what pension funds have been investing in and how they've changed up their whole assets, it's quite interesting to look at. So if you look at what pension funds were investing in the 1950s, they basically had, maybe 5% of their portfolio in equities and maybe around 95% of their portfolio in fixed income, so and cash. So mostly bonds, corporate and government bonds. More than 95% of their investments were in bonds. But now, if you go to a 2016, which is not 2020, but if you go to 2016, they have, more than 70% in equity. And so it's almost 75% in equity. And they only have around, you know, 26, 7-ish% in actual fixed income. So bonds and cash. Now, cash isn't really fixed income, but I mean, bonds and cash. And so they've just completely changed up their whole asset class uh, distribution. And, they're a lot more into equities now. So I guess that's better inflation hedged. But the problem is if your equities don't do very well, well, then a lot of people aren't really going to get their pensions. A lot of people, aren't going to receive what they were promised. And so I think that's going to put pressure on the government to kind of prop up the whole asset market so that people could retire. And if you're out of, if you have no more options, I think the government will probably do something to directly pour money into the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid pensions, all of this, and to basically guarantee that people get enough money to retire. And so a lot of people call this, a a Ponzi scheme. Technically speaking, how it works, the technical aspect, sure, yeah, I think it is a Ponzi scheme. Now, some people say, we should have it because we're a developed country, we should have it because of ethics. I think it's bad for the economy as a whole, but if you want to make an ethical argument or something like that, there's really no way to debate ethics because it's all about what goals you have. It's all about that. I mean, if you it's too subjective. So I don't want to go into that debate, but on an economic perspective, I don't think it's really good for the economy to have these, social securities, pensions, especially if you're forced into paying for them, which to me doesn't make too much sense. But, I don't think it's too good for the economy as a whole. And if you look at the trust fund of the Social Security, its actual net income, let's say, has been actually increasing. It's actually been doing quite well ever since it got started. It's had some trouble in the early 1960s. It's had some trouble in the 1970s and early 80s, in the mid 70s and early 80s. But ever since it's actually kept up, and it's actually kind of earned more money than it's really had to spend. Now, in the recent years, its net increase of assets have kind of just stayed stagnant. It hasn't really increased its net assets, hasn't really lost anything. Its total income and its total costs have kind of stayed the same. But before that, its net assets have always kind of increased. But it's in the recent years, around 2018, that it's kind of just stayed the same. It's not growing, it's not shrinking, and it's had some periods like that throughout its history. But the important thing is the age demographic structure of the whole US population. And that is really important. And a lot of people talk about that for retirement. Again, the boomers have a huge, huge population. The silent generation didn't. And now all the boomers are going to get the unfunded liabilities that are unfunded. So we don't really have the money there yet. So we're relying on future income to pay for these things. And where will future income take us? That's kind of a bet, because now we're raising taxes everywhere. And is that really good for future income? Yes, we're going to tax more money directly, but are people going to move out of the states? That's a possibility. GDP is back up now, but how long is it going to last? And how high will the real GDP go? because the nominal GDP, it could go high, but the real GDP, that's what matters to retirees. So will the real GDP keep up forever? I mean, that's a hard question to ask. And, an important thing is that if we get inflation, the fixed income people, the people who are receiving Social Security benefits, the people who are receiving pensions, these guys are going to spend a lot less money. Now, I don't think the pensions and Social Security's benefits will actually be defaulted on just because of politics. Politics will never let that happen. Now, they're probably going to run out of money eventually just because of the age demographic structure. It's not very beneficial for the retirement of these people, but I don't think the politicians are going to let them get away with it. And let's say they just print money and use that printed money to give it to these retirees because Social Security is going to run out of money. Well, that's not going to cause too much inflation, and at least for these guys, it won't. So it's not really the big worry for retirees. It's not really it's not really that Social Security or your pensions are going to run out of money. That's not the biggest worry. The biggest worry is that you're going to get some type of inflation. Now, look, I'm not saying that the inflation from the actual the actual printing of money to give to these Social Security or pension funds, I'm not saying that's the big inflationary worry, but I think other inflationary worries from other, reasons, it's your bigger reason, which doesn't necessarily have to do with printing money for your retirement needs. And so you have this big retirement problem across everywhere, really. If you look at China, China in their 1970s period, they were having a ton of children, and around 1979, they had their one-child policy. Around before 1980s, they were having a ton of children, and then the children population just quickly declined, and their estimates. I mean, if you look at their population right now, it's also a third less than their maximum population. Around a third, not exactly, but around a third. And that's a very big difference. That's a very big difference, because that just means you're going to have less and less children, unless if something changes. Because if you look at the rate that things are happening, and that's why now they changed their 2-child policy to a 3-child policy from a 1-child policy. Now, I don't really understand why they don't just make it an infinite child policy, because if you're going to have 3 children, I mean, who even has 3 children? Not that many people. If you have 3 children, I mean, does an extra child hurt? Because the further you go on that more children distribution, the less people there are that have that one more child. So I don't think they should just make it so that you could have as many children as you want. I don't understand why you want to limit it to 3 children when people that have 3 children, there's such a low chance that they're going to have a 4th. But if you look at the prediction for how many children China will have, that's actually quite scary, because according to the United Nations, if you go to 2050, the child population will be basically half. The new child policy, population, not policy, will basically be for each decade, the new quantity of children being born in 2050 will pretty much be half of the maximum decade of how many children were born. So the age group around, well, you could say half a decade. The age group of 60 to 64 will be over 60,000 children, when the age group of around 0 to 4 will only be around 30 something thousand children. So the whole world is kind of facing this problem where before everybody was worried about overpopulation. Now everybody's worried about underpopulation, where you have this young population who can't really support their old fellows because they're entitled to all these benefits, and governments around the world are too politically concerned to cancel them or to find a more reasonable solution instead of running out of money. But to kind of summarize, I don't think that for the retirees, your biggest problem is losing your social security benefits, losing your pensions. I don't think that's your biggest issue. I don't think the biggest issue is that the government's going to print money just to give you your pension. That's better than running out of money for your pension. And the inflation you're going to get from that alone is quite insignificant. But I think the big issue you need to watch out for is if we get inflation from a bigger source, and we get 4, 5, 6, 7%, 8% inflation. That's really going to destroy all the people who are trying to retire. That's really going to destroy people who are living off of fixed income. Or if we just get a crash and the government doesn't save the markets, then the pensions, the social securities, their assets are going to collapse as well. But luckily, I think the governments are still going to try to save the retirees. And so again, biggest issue, I don't think it's running out of money because it's backed by the central banks, by the governments. But I think the biggest issue is inflation that is not really created by printing these retirement benefits.